right, dear friends, how you doing? This is Edward from Chasing Breed, Virginia. We have the pleasure of having Cameron Hamilton here. We're going to do an interview on several topics. Cameron, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited to hear, all that you have to say to the voters and to understand and to actually get to know you a little bit better and to see how do you feel about these questions. And I'm going to start right away asking you about faith. So we believe that religious freedom and religious liberty is a cornerstone of our Constitution and must be protected. And during the course of your life, what have you done to demonstrate this belief?
It's a great question. So I've tried to live my faith out as best I can, obviously imperfectly, because there's only one who lived it perfectly, and he was about 2,000 years ago. Having said that, I was baptized when I became a man and committed my life to Christ. My testimony of faith really comes out with how I try to treat others. Generally, for the most part, I try to embody the characteristics of good charity and goodwill, to be benevolent and kind where I can, also all the while, embodying strength where possible. So my faith is demonstrated through the church that we go to, through the way in which we study the Bible at home with my family, the way in which we pray daily and convey and ask the Almighty to give us his wisdom and insight for the challenges today. If you knew me very well, you would see very evidently that I am a man of faith, a great faith. And when I introduce myself first and foremost as a father, a husband, and a Christian.
Amen to that. Well, just switching gears to family, that is an essential part of who we are as a country. We believe that the family is the most essential and most empowering organization in our shared human experience. What are your thoughts on the status of the American family today in America? And if you're elected, what will you do to uplift and promote the restoration of the American family?
Yeah, the American family is in decline. The American family has become socially taboo in the United States, which I find appalling. I'm a father, I'm a husband as well, so I'm a man who has young children. That's partially why I'm doing this, why I'm running for public office, because I believe they deserve better representation in DC than they've been getting. From a federal perspective, as it pertains towards supporting families, I think that part of that is through public imaging and ensuring that you embody those characteristics that others can identify with. We are a young family, and I think there's a lot to look up to there. At the same time, advocating for policies that reaffirm families and the integrity of the family, I think, is essential. That marries back in with my faith and many other characteristics. I think right now we've given a financial incentive for many struggling women to pursue motherhood outside of the context of a marriage. While I understand wanting to support women, and I believe firmly that we should, I still think that the promotion of good male-female relationships and strong family units is the best way for us to address the rising crime, the rising social disruption, and frankly, the tribalism that we find in the American demographic on the social landscape.
In terms of civil rights, we believe that all citizens, in order to realize their fullest potential, are entitled to equal rights, equal justice, and equal opportunity, but not equal outcomes. With that regard, what do you think is the most present issue that we're facing right now and what would you do to help if you're elected?
So civil rights is absolutely something that's essential for my campaign and my platform. You will not find a greater civil rights advocate on the Republican field other than myself. I've been endorsed by Rand Paul and Thomas Massey, if that shows you anything of the perspective in which I'm willing to go through to fight for people's indefensible or defensible liberties. I opposed the COVID vaccine mandates when I was a civil servant employee at DHS. I believed it was grotesquely unconstitutional, and I risked my job to do so with a large organization called Feds for Freedom, and we ultimately won the Fifth Circuit Court. The constitutionality of that claim was very paramount. If we weren't willing to push back on the federal government intruding into our rights and sovereignty as human beings over what procedures we take and don't take, where will we draw the line? So I'm absolutely advocating for the entirety of our civil rights. I think it's to be a straw argument when we see the National Defense Authorization Act, which is funded by Congress, and then in the NDAA was slipped the 702 extension. That extension spying program has spied on Americans, had violated their rights, and also infringed on their privacy almost 300,000 times. That's a prime example of Republicans not standing up for the civil rights and for the Constitution in the way in which they should. Those are things I radically oppose.
Right, and in terms of criminal justice, and we believe that men and women are innocent until proven guilty. What are your concerns regarding the criminal justice systems as it is today? And if you're elected, what will you do? For example, mass incarceration, prisons, U.S. drug policy. What will be your plans or your
So
what will you
I
do?
I actually never supported the minimum sentencing requirements that you saw in a lot of municipalities. The rationale there being that I think it applied a blanket policy and judicial recourse against a large demographic of people that frankly each had their case worthy of being argued before a judge individually. I don't like to see minimum sentencing. I don't like to see prerogatives with, well, you fit in this category, in this box, therefore the consequences are going to fit perfectly within this box. I believe every human being has the dignity to have their case heard before a judge and to have the unique circumstances argued and compelling information brought forth to an actual judge to determine the appropriate outcome. I personally believe that another avenue that we should be pursuing more in our criminal justice system is giving people who are being brought up on petty crime charges, giving them the option of straightening their life out and joining the military. And in consequence, it would scrub their previous record. I think that's a healthy construct. Give them a good outlet that would be of benefit to society, of benefit for themselves. So when it comes to criminal justice reform now, it's very difficult to argue from the perspective of pushing back against the defund the police movement. I thought that movement was Marxist in origin, and it's absolutely antithetical to everything we believe here in the restoration of law and order. So I believe firmly in backing the blue. I believe firmly in supporting our law enforcement efforts, but also ensuring that they are held accountable when they do step outside the boundaries of the law, so as to ensure that the public and an American taxpayer has full faith and confidence in the execution of law.
Great. And talking about the Second Amendment, some states, including Virginia, have passed the red flag laws. They're also referred as to the gun violence restraining orders, extreme risk protection orders, emergency substantial risk orders. So, what are your thoughts about these laws, and what will you do about them?
I radically oppose the red flag laws because I see them as an infringement on people's Fourth Amendment rights and their ability to advocate their case before a judge. If we are going to restrain the individual rights of anyone, man, woman, child, it does not matter. There is a legal process in which we should be undertaking, and that is an awesome power and responsibility that should be used extremely, reluctantly by the state, only in very egregious circumstances. So I think with the growth of the police state kind of infrastructure of, wanting to prosecute every form of crime, I find that to be a huge consequence. I understand the nature of gun violence and why people think that with public sympathy and appeal, we should just simply ban guns or make it difficult to get. I understand how that might seem like a legitimate argument on paper. What we know, though, is that that doesn't translate in the common world. It doesn't translate in reality. So I've been radically opposed to any and all form of red flag laws because I don't believe they actually secure the opportunities for every American to have safety and stability, the manner in which they're publicly perceived.
All right, great. And switching gears a little bit to the right of life, we believe that all life is precious and must be protected. What are your thoughts regarding children conceived in the case of rape or incest?
Those are terrible scenarios. Don't get me wrong. They're difficult to contend with. I believe every human being is created in the image of God. I believe every human being should have the opportunity for life. I believe that right now we have an entire environment politically that's driving women to abortion, believing those are their only outcomes. I say no. I think there are other outcomes that we should be pursuing. I'd love to strip all federal funding from Planned Parenthood and divert all of that towards crisis pregnancy centers and towards resources that actually will assist mothers in need, to include providing them with diapers, with baby formula, with things that you need on a tangible basis that Planned Parenthood will not provide. I think that's the best way to deal with this scenario, is to support mothers, to ensure that men are held accountable when women are giving birth by themselves, to ensure that we have a robust infrastructure that overhauls how our adoption laws are reconciled and the costs associated with them. We have people who are on over a year-long wait period just to adopt a child. It's exorbitantly expensive. Those are examples of bureaucracy that are not making it easier for women to find other means. So again, I'm completely pro-life. I always will be. I believe that every human being has dignity and worth, and I would love to see our government enact policy that supports women rather than simply thinking that, well, abortion is their only option.
Talking about the Constitution as well, we talk about Second Amendment, and now we talk about the Constitution. We believe that is the law of the land, and that individual rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as enriched in the Bill of Rights, serve to limit government as intended by the founders. What have you done over the course of your life in demonstration of that belief?
Again, opposing the vaccine mandate was another key area where the executive branch, through Executive Order 14043, sought to impose a health restriction and mandate on an entire demographic of federal government employees when they did not have the authority. So I saw it as a responsibility as a civic servant, as a public servant for that matter, to sign on to a lawsuit that ultimately brought claim against the federal government to rescind that order. Eventually, that order was in fact rescinded, so we had some form of alleviation. It wasn't quite as aggressive as we were hoping, but nonetheless, that's a prime example of states pushing back. Other areas would be obviously subject towards the elevation of state and local autonomy. I think that we have an imbalance right now in our government. The federal bureaucracy has expanded far beyond what the founders intended, and we've really seen a suppression of the state and local municipalities. I don't support that distortion. I'm a strong 10th and 9th Amendment advocate. I believe that the imbalance should be corrected by advocating very firmly for states' rights. An example of what that looks like is when the state of West Virginia pushed back against EPA for their regulatory requirements on coal and on other energy production. They won in the Supreme Court. I think that's a prime example. What would I do as a legislator down the road? Lord willing, I'd actually rescind funding from federal agencies that are engaging in egregious oversight of responsibility when they never had enumerated powers to do so.
Right, awesome. And switching gears to national defense, we believe that peace is preserved through a strong national defense. What does it mean to you, and how would you prioritize in relation to all the other competing priorities you have, say, if you're elected?
So I think our national defense needs to be extremely lethal and extremely capable. I believe that is a strong deterrent for future conflict. What we've seen right now under this administration is chaos and war and expanded conflict in multi-different fronts across many different geographical regions because of a perceived weakness of the United States and many Western European powers. That's a categorical problem. I'm not an isolationist. At the same time, I'm not a hyper-interventionist. I believe that we need to be very reserved and diligent about when we intervene militarily. And I believe that some of the old military hawks of the Bush era are too aggressive. I do not favor that foreign policy model. Having said that, I also think that when we project weakness, we create more instability in the world as well. That's a major problem that has implication on a lot of innocent civilians. So I believe our armed forces should be the biggest, baddest, strongest, most capable that the world has ever seen. I would like to keep it in reserve. I'd like to see our wartime readiness drills expanded so that if and when we get the call, we are able to deploy between 1 and 200,000 personnel, all extremely capable, extremely lethal, with the robust set of technological infrastructure we have, so as to win war quickly with as minimal loss of life as possible. I believe that nature of building up our military machine and holding it in reserve is the appropriate way for us to go about having a strong national defense, so that when we commit those forces, they will not be drawn out into a long, protracted war. Instead, it will be short, sweet, decisive, and it will end quickly. That's the way I'd like to see warfare engaged.
All right. And switching to economy, the subject is sensitive to many, especially because of the inflation and suffering that many people are having currently. We believe that free enterprise is the system, is the most productive supplier of human needs and economic justice. Fiscal responsibility and budgetary restraints must be exercised by all levels of government. But there is some people that believe that we should instead move towards a more socialistic economics, such like basic living wage, for example. What is your position on these issues, and what do you think you will do regarding them?
I radically oppose basic minimum wage. I don't think our economy is resilient or large enough or robust enough to do that. If we lived in a country, if we were a country like Norway, the second richest GDP in the world per capita, we'd be having completely different conversations, because we would be having a net surplus every single year, the likes of which we are excuse me, I got a motorcycle outside. The likes of which, our national treasury will just be built up at a pretty monstrous level. That's not reality for the United States right now. So we don't have the resources to really provide some of those more socialistic services like free healthcare, free education, things like that. That's just not reality for the United States, nor do I think it should be. I believe the role of the government should be to minimize the tax burden and minimize the administrative burden upon the individual and upon the small business, so they retain more private capital, they retain more personal wealth, and they can invest and innovate where they see appropriate. It's a value structure and it's a value judgment between competing interests. I would rather see more money and more resources in the hands of the taxpayer that can choose where to invest it and how, as opposed to in the hands of bureaucrats in DC who fund pet projects and initiatives that don't really benefit Americans' lives. So I'm a staunch libertarian when it comes to the economy. I'm also a radical free trade advocate, believing very firmly trade should be free, open, fair, should be prerequisite based upon relationships between other nations, and should very clearly allow the consumer to pay less, because when the cost of production, the cost of transportation, and the cost of energy goes down, everyone benefits across the board.
Great. And I mean, we're going to be talking about our beloved Commonwealth, Virginia, and Virginia history. And we believe that our history and the associated memory would serve as a guidepost in our journey as a nation, to serve as reminders of our shared sacrifices and warnings for the future generations. What are your thoughts on the current events regarding historical monuments in Virginia, and what would you do to restore, protect the historical symbols, icons, and statues, and our traditions?
Yeah, I've never supported the removal of monuments. I believe they should be preserved. They're historical in nature, whether you agree with them or not. I think that they're excellent for future generations to study, to understand the times, and to understand the compelling arguments of the day. So I believe they should be preserved. They should be left as monuments, either where they're currently resting or in some kind of a commonly accessible area where they can be viewed by all. The history of them can be, again, interpreted and evaluated and discussed. The merits of the cases of the past can always be argued. I think that's part of our intellectual, stimulation that we need here. The intellectual honesty of knowing that the past sometimes there are good and there are bad things about the past, and we should be open and transparent about each of those. We shouldn't show favoritism or political bias towards one narrative or the other. So I've never supported the removal of statues and monuments. I believe they should be preserved and studied. And I believe that the rich history of Virginia should be celebrated. Overwhelmingly, it has so much more that benefits the United States as opposed to comes as a detriment to the United States.
Right. And in that same train of thought, education comes to mind. And what role do you believe the state has in education regarding morality, religion, gender identity? If you're elected, what will you change if you change anything?
I think the state has no role in virtually any of those, with the exception of some morality. We do have morality indicated within our laws. People say you can't legislate morality. Well, yes, we can. We believe that murder is wrong. We believe theft is wrong. Those are inherently moral arguments. So I think right now the state should only be focused upon the limited framework of what's considered criminal. As it pertains to education, I have serious concerns with the federal government's growth and expansion and insertion of political ideology into the field of education. They don't set policy which is mandatory and compelled by law. They do, however, set guidelines and parameters and give guidance, which is then adopted by states, which is then used and weaponized against American parents. I have serious concerns with this. So I think it's a twofold problem. Number one, the state has gobbled up more and more responsibility that we've given them. Number two, parents have frankly absconded responsibility that is theirs, and they should be invested at their local level. This is part of the reason why we go to our school board meetings, we go to our board of supervisor meetings. We need to be invested in our local communities. So the best way to fix education, I believe firmly, number one is in the home. Number two, start locally within your county, within your school board, and within your immediate circle. And then number three, slowly branch it out from there. The federal government's role in education is really almost nothing. I would rather see the Department of Education acting as a facilitator between state bodies to communicate, and that's it.
Right, great. And regarding veterans, according to the Virginia Department of Veteran Services, here in Virginia, there are about eight. What do you think is the biggest issue facing veterans today, and what will you do about them?
I think right now we have a lot of veterans who are not receiving the accessible care that they need. I think that's a huge problem. I think also, part of the reason why our military medical infrastructure is not really serving current and former service members as well as it could be. So it focuses a lot of its attention on dependent care, not actual warfighter care. I think that's an imbalance too that should be corrected. Having said all of that, veterans want to pay less in taxes. They want to ensure that their benefits are well compensated and that they have access to affordable, reasonable health care for service related disabilities. I think it's our obligation to ensure that we meet those. I'd like to see more veteran services offered through referrals and on the civilian market, because if we don't have capacity to deal with them at VA hospitals, I think we should allow individuals to go pursue these at civilian hospitals and other localities. I also think it would be wise and prudent for the VA, as well as the Department of Defense, to engage in exchange partnerships between different physicians and localities, whereby doctors, nurses, PAs, you name it, from local hospitals can then go through apprenticeship periods where they study, work, and learn under a military medical system, and they can see and understand the dynamics. I believe those exchange programs should even extend towards combat zones, allowing civilians to join the warfighter effort, not commissioning them as officers, but instead allowing them to be registered as civilian reserves, which are ultimately serving under either the Public Health Service Corps or other things to support the war effort overseas and to ensure that service members who are overseas receive the best care possible.
Awesome. Well, we'll move for the tough questions now. The easies are done. We're going to do very personal ones. What is your favorite book and why?
Oh man, that's a great question. One of my favorite books is obviously The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. I think it was a very interesting novel that talks about the future of the world and what it means to be an innovator and a builder, what it means to actually design and construct something, what it means to live with boldness and conviction and push against the status quo, push against the rest of society that's devolving. I also love the book As a Man Thinketh by Allen. I think it's a strong argument over challenging the individual about what it means to live with culpability. I think that's a really intellectually stimulating book. There's many other books to say. My favorite book, of course, is obviously the Bible and many associated books therein. I love the book of Joel, the Epistle of James, and many others. So there's plenty of books that I could mention, but those are probably a few that I would mention very highly. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life is also a really excellent read too.
From Jordan Peterson, is it? Yeah. So if you could meet in person one historical figure, who would that person be, and what would you talk about?
Oh, first and foremost, it would be Jesus of Nazareth. That would be the first person I'd want to meet if I had the chance to, which, Lord willing, I will, after I leave this earth. Aside from him, there's several other that I could think of. They're each unique in their own compelling way. My family is related to the grandfather of Alexander Hamilton. I would love to meet with him and talk to him about federalism. I have some very contrary opinions that he does. I'm much more of a Madisonian, even though I am a Hamilton. I would love to meet James Madison, particularly within U.S. history, and also George Washington. I think they're really unique and compelling people. But from history of old, I would also love to talk with Josephus, one of the ancient historians of the day, who experienced so many different circumstances, traveled the world in totally unique and compelling ways. I would love to be a fly on the wall to hear some of his insight and experiences with how he perceived the natural world and different historical events going on.
All right, great. Well, I mean, this has been a great interview. I really appreciate your answers, and
Thank you.
We're grateful at Chasing Freedom, Virginia, that you give us the opportunity to this interview, and we wish you the best. So I don't know if you want to say a last word before we close.
Just thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the time. It's an absolute honor to be here. For those of you that are listening, I hope I've given responses that are aligning with your values. I'd encourage you to go to CameronHamilton.com, check out my campaign, see what I stand for. I believe openness and transparency are paramount. So those are things that you can expect from me. Even if they're controversial, I'm willing to give you my honest assessment and opinion on things.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless you.